Gonna assume opponents. Are you ready?
Give me 1 second.
Oh, yeah, take as
Yeah,
much time.
maybe it might be better if we get started at 2:30.
I
Okay,
know,
yeah.
I just know it's being live streamed and on the YouTube it says it's scheduled for 2:30. So I don't know if they want us to start at 2:30, but
Okay, yeah, no worries. Okay, that's 12:30. So 2:30. So guess what? Start again. I'm Charlie Price, first speaker for Myers Park. This is the 4-minute negative constructive. Let's just opponents. Are you ready to start? Awesome. Judges, are you ready to start? Great. Okay. Then, without further ado, I'll begin the 4-minute negative constructive in 3, 2, 1. We are in opposition to the U.S. federal government substantially increasing its surveillance infrastructure along its southern border. Our first contention is combating cartels. Mexico has made progress combating cartel violence right now, which is preserved when you vote for us. Panda24 writes that this is the fourth straight year of progress. Mexico's peacefulness improved 1.4% in 2023 with all 5 indicators. The new Mexican president has cracked down. Katherine 24 states that security improves with Scheinbaum. As mayor, she poured money into the police force, raised salaries, and collaborated to confront groups. Crimes declined precipitously. There is optimism about Scheinbaum's strategy. Increasing surveillance checks this progress in two ways. First is by galvanizing recruitment. Asher 20 writes that surveillance tools could generate target lists for deportation or reject asylum en masse to speedily deport more than 11 million. That fuels cartels, as AP17 confirms that jobless deportees swell the ranks of cartels, sparking violence. Violent gangs emerged when migrants were deported by the U.S. in 2012. Cartels need recruitment, as Prieto Corral 23 explains. Cartels lose many members as a result of conflict. Recruiting 370 people per week is essential to avoid collapse. Reducing recruitment could substantially lower cartel size. Second is fueling profits. Solace 23 states that smugglers continue to cross. While the towers make crossing more difficult, it just means the cartels can charge more money. Overall, the AF will fuel violence, as HRMI 19 states that a stronger border will increase fragile tensions between top drug syndicates and the government. An uneasy alliance exists, and historically, when routes are threatened, it results in war. In 2012, Mexico saw its worst spike in crime. Cartels possess weaponry and paramilitaries that rival the Mexican army. The impact of this is state collapse, as NDIC writes that U.S. Command reported that Mexico bears consideration for a rapid and sudden collapse due to sustained assault and pressure by criminal gangs and the escalation of drug-related violence and potential impacts to U.S. national security. Our second contention is the labor shortage. Increasing surveillance would drastically reduce the migrant labor force. Undocumented immigrants make up nearly half the agricultural force, as NAS 22 explains that the agricultural industry relies on a predominantly immigrant workforce. 44% of farm workers are undocumented immigrants who lack work authorization. When border surveillance has increased, there's been a notable result of high deportation. Surveillance infrastructure increases deportation, as GIST 17 says that the DHS component responsible for enforcement at the border saw its border agent manpower rise from 10,000 in 2003 to 17,000 in 2008. These resulted in a record of nearly 360,000 formal removals in 2008. So if we were to increase surveillance, we would devastate the already depleting workforce. That causes agricultural collapse. As Garfield 17 reads, if we were to engage in massive deportations, our agricultural system would collapse. Of the 1.5 to 2 million people working in agriculture today, at least 50 to 70% of farm workers are undocumented immigrants. If the U.S. were to deport a significant portion of them, the move could result in a labor and food production shortages. A large-scale labor shortage could therefore lead to a 5 to 6% jump in food prices for consumers. Raising food prices puts pressure on the most vulnerable, as food prices increases exacerbate food insecurity. Mo Kahini 23 explains that according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, when food prices rose 9.5%, 58% of surveyed middle-income families and 68% of lower-income families reported it became harder to afford food for their children. Food insecurity is a cause for much worse, as food insecurity is inexplicably linked with poverty. NIH 21 states that food insecurity is inextricably linked to poverty, with 35.3% of households with incomes below the federal poverty line being food insecure. So to preserve the Mexican state from cartel collapse and avoid poverty from food insecurity, we urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
Can I call for a few pieces of evidence? Can I have the first one, that it's the fourth year of progress on C1, and then on the impact, the war in 2012,
Yeah,
and
of
then,
course, right now.
and then on C2, that increase in surveillance led to more deportations, all of the evidence about that, and then 50 to 70% of the labor workforce or agricultural workforce is undocumented immigrants.
Okay, so let me just make sure I got this right. You want first 1.4% increase or progress. Can you tell me what the second one was?
The war in 2012.
The 2012 warrant. It's up. That fuels cartels, AP17. Okay. Third one.
Surveillance increases deportations.
Gotcha. Just send the first two. Surveillance increases deportation. That's a Chisty evidence. Right there. Surveillance infrastructure increases deportation. Okay, and was there one more?
Yeah, the last one was 50 to 70% of the agricultural labor force are undocumented immigrants.
Okay, send her the Garfield 17 one. All right, got all of that sent. If you could confirm that's in the file, you can see all that.
Sounds good. Thank you.
I got all of it.
Great.
Okay.
We are ready for constructive.
Okay, great. Again, I'm Katherine, first speaker for Richard Montgomery. Is everyone good? Okay. Richard Montgomery affirms the resolution. Contention 1 is combating cartels. The power of cartels are growing, as Murray 24 finds that in Mexico, they control a third of the country, more territory than ever before. And corrupt border officials support cartels as well, as Bradley 23 writes that agents turn a blind eye through deceit, assault, and human smuggling. Thus, surveillance is crucial to control cartels in 3 ways. Subpoint A is arms. The border is a hotspot for arms. As Lemus 24 writes, it warrants 90% of firearms in Mexico pass through the U.S. These guns from the U.S. drive deadly violence, and Lowy 23 finds that it's caused a 60% spike in homicides in Mexico near the border. Luckily, surveillance solves. Gore 21 finds that surveillance capabilities act as a force multiplier for a badly overstretched border patrol. Cameras and radar systems are reliable, cost-effective, and don't require extra manpower. Importantly, Gore finds that these systems have already been built and are just waiting to be deployed. Crucially, Lowy finds that the way to stop Mexican cartels is to stop supplying them with guns. Cartels terrorize civilians, causing nearly 30,000 annual firearm deaths alone. Subpoint B is drugs. Zill of PBS finds that the largest marketplace for illegal drugs is the US, and the problem is surveillance. Rosenblum 21 writes that the inadequate inspection equipment is why Border Patrol only scans 2% of all vehicles at the border right now. All we need to do is to implement these systems. As Strickler 24 writes, that high-tech scanners can spot fentanyl crossing the border, but these scanners are sitting in warehouses unused because Congress hasn't appropriated funds to install them. And controlling drug trafficking is key. The influx of smuggled drugs into the U.S. have caused 200 deaths every day, and over 250,000 Americans have died from a fentanyl overdose since 2018. Subpoint C is human trafficking. In the past year, Beer 24 finds that human trafficking increased massively, with 72% of victims being immigrants. Updated surveillance like biometrics is crucial. As Zevo 19 writes, it can prevent the cross-border transportation of victims since traffickers can't easily forge new identities. Thus, Eastman 21 writes that facial recognition software also identifies trafficking victims 60% faster. And the impact is violence against victims. Loose surveillance has led to rampant trafficking. According to Rodriguez 22, 57,000 victims have been trafficked into the U.S. annually across the southern border, and the true number is likely much larger. Preventing this is key, as Shelley 10 writes, the rates of mortality are especially high amongst trafficking victims. Thus, because of arms, drugs, and human trafficking, cartels are destroying Mexico. Corral 23 finds that 3 years from now, the Mexican drug cartels would be more powerful than the state itself, and Mexico could become a failed state. And McManus 19 writes, as Mexico is unable to protect its citizens, it's slipping towards national collapse. Crucially, Mexico is America's largest trading partner, amounting to $800 billion. And thus, Contreras 23 terminalizes that losing the U.S.-Mexico relationship could cost billions in trade, since supply chains would be disrupted, and millions of jobs in the U.S. depend on that binational relationship. Contention 2 is international conflict. Trust in the U.S. is decreasing. Hunter 22 explains, leaders are beginning to wonder whether U.S. commitment remains, and border weakness is the last straw. Irwin 24 writes, U.S. allies are worried that the influx of migrants and chaos at the border poses a risk because adversaries can sense that America is declining. But the AF world solves because it revolutionizes security. IEE 24 writes, numerous technologies have revolutionized border surveillance and development, and CBP 20 finds that surveillance provides the agents with a flexible, autonomous system that enhances effectiveness. Crucially, perception is key. Schlavo 22 writes, America's failure to control its southern border contributes to the broader erosion of an international order and Washington's commitments. As the U.S. is seen as weak, it emboldens America's autocratic adversaries. As Master 24 writes, that the U.S. weakness is a green light for Putin's invasion of Ukraine, aggression in the South China Sea, Iran's proxy wars in the Middle East, and others. These recent conflicts have caused over 130,000 casualties and risk creating long-term civil wars in the future, affecting millions. For these reasons, we are proud to affirm.
Yeah. Could we get your card that says there will be Mexican collapse in 3 years?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. And then we're ready to start cross once we get that.
Okay. I just put it in the bottom. Let me know if you see it.
Okay, thank you. All right.
All right.
Okay, so hoping you're ready for a cross text.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Judges, are you all ready? Great, then we can begin in 3, 2, 1. So do you mind if we have the first question since we spoke first?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. So throughout your case, I'm seeing a lot of words like implementing cameras, radars, high-tech scanners. I think you said at one point facial recognition, correct?
Mhm.
Could you give us some sort of time frame or cost, or just how much what will it take to put these things on the border, physically get them there, get them to start working, get them to scan, surveil?
Yeah, so what the Gore and Strickler evidence already indicates is that these technologies that use revolutionary security already exist. The problem is that we just haven't implemented them yet.
So
So
what we're asking, how long will it take to implement them?
I would say maybe like a year, a couple months to a couple of years. I don't really
Okay.
know the time frame because I don't work for a security company, but I assume it would be much less than developing this security from scratch. Let's
All
talk
right.
about your contention one
Thank you.
about cartels, right? So what is the incentive for cartels to gain power?
The incentive for cartels to gain power, like to make
In
money,
general, in general.
to have control, to expand growth.
So without some sort of like surveillance or anything controlling them, won't they just have this incentive still and continue to develop?
I understand where you're going with that. And what we're saying just off bat is that we're not saying that there's no surveillance. We're specifically arguing for the Mexican surveillance that's being implemented right now. If you look to our first two pieces of evidence on increase from Scheinbaum cracking down and increased piece
Wait,
of the
Steinbaum hasn't entered office yet.
No, look to our Kirchhoff
Mayoral.
evidence when she was in
Yeah,
Mexico.
I am looking at that evidence. Scheinbaum has only been elected. She's the elect, but she hasn't entered office yet or made policy.
Mayoral candidate in the city of Mexico, Mexico City. Does that clarify?
Right. Yes.
Mayor, when she was there, and now that she's going into office, we saw when she was in office, she was cracking down, right? We also saw a 4-year span of progress and increased peace. So what we're saying is there is surveillance. It's just coming from the Mexican side. We're arguing that this American surveillance is going to make these cartels much more powerful. Could I have a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So looking at the evidence we asked for, what we're seeing, could you scroll to it real quick? Yeah, so what we're seeing is it's not exactly saying that there are 3 years left till the Mexican state collapse. It's more just rhetoric coming from a senator. Is that JD Vance that's saying? So do you have any, statistics from an expert on the subject or someone who's done analysis or research saying that there will be a Mexican state collapse and not a, rhetorical device from a politician?
Right. So I understand that it is rhetoric, but if you look at literally every other piece of evidence in our case, I can send that if you would like, it does indicate some sort of instability that is because of drug cartels. So I can offer that if you want, but that's cross.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to take prep?
We'll take running prep time.
Quick question. Do you want the evidence?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
Seconds.
That's 30 seconds of time, so we'll stop our prep time here. So just to provide an off-time roadmap, first we're going to be going over an overview, and then we're just going to go down the opponent's case and on some conversation from the cross-examination. Is that good with everybody? Okay. Opponents ready and judges ready? Yep. All right. I will start my time in 3, 2, 1. So first, let's start with surveillance technology as a whole. Surveillance technology ultimately fails. Construction takes way too long and destroys local economies. Zelensky 19 writes that it would take 11 years to build 1,000 miles of barrier, which would be required in order to have a true substantial increase in surveillance, which is only half the size of the southern border, according to the White House. Labor availability determines construction duration, and currently, construction is the tightest labor market in over 2 decades. This means there would no longer be workers available for construction activity for years. Even then, construction is a major disruption to the local economies of several states. This project could absorb every single worker within 200 miles. In less populated areas, it could take twice as long. This means if you vote for them, you have no idea when surveillance will actually be usable, meaning you don't know what you're voting for on their side. Additionally, because the Mexican cartels are incredibly important, especially on my opponent's points on arms and drugs, we have to focus on their skills and adaptation. Mexican cartels have adapted in the face of new border realities, and they will adapt again. As new barriers increased risks, they will innovate smuggling operations, raise their prices, and stimulate markets. These adaptations occurred after 9/11, the last time America tightened its border security. They have used cloned vehicles that resemble cars to transport money through these seemingly foolproof scanners that our opponents talk about to the border where they can pass it to their associates on the other side. Cartel members have also routinely placed hundreds of thousands of dollars on vast numbers of gift cards to reduce bulky shipments and thereby decreasing law enforcement's ability to detect the movement of money, meaning that if we are to grow our surveillance on the border, these multi-billion-dollar near governmental size organizations will simply be able to adapt and continue with their processes to make their millions. Now let's move on to our opponent's point on cartels. Remember our evidence that tells you that we're currently at a turning point. We tell you that for 4 years straight, there has been 1.4% increase in peacefulness based on violence in the country. They say that Sheinbaum evidence isn't necessarily connected because she's president-elect, but she was president of the capital of Mexico City, where she was specifically cracking down with new legislation. And now that she's the president-elect, she will continue to do that in order to keep things at bay. We are at a turning point and we cannot spin that around. Our opponents are attempting to tell you that there's this big devolving and that they're going to be more powerful in 3 years, but you cannot trust their evidence. Our evidence comes from empirics, where theirs comes from a spouting off from a Kentucky news anchor who was going crazy after his wife disappeared and was speaking to the people in his local news area. You cannot trust this evidence over our evidence that gives you empirics that specifically tell you that there has been an upward scale when it comes to peacefulness. Now let's move on to my opponent's points on arms. Cartels have tons of other markets supplying them with weaponry. Surveillance isn't the whole issue. Ruiz 23 writes that Mexican cartels have acquired a broad range of weaponry. Illegal markets providing weapons originate from other countries such as China, Russia, Korea, South Africa, and even Europe and Israel. U.S.-Mexican surveillance also can't solve for Floridian ports. Freeman 23 writes that American guns traffic through Florida ports fuel crime and is a conduit that fuels violence and is every bit as destabilizing. We already know that they're going to be able to go to other markets. Therefore, we cannot trust that they're not going to stop, especially given the fact that the guns provide them with power. Additionally, Biden has already been pushing for legislation that has been helping increase gun charges. So we should not throw a wrench in all of the current plans and trigger all of our negative impacts when it comes to the state collapse and the negative fields for labor and agriculture. Now let's move on to their point on drugs. Loss of drug trafficking and profits from cartels ultimately mean that cartels will diversify to more violence. Katherine 23 writes that a solution would not be sufficient to address Mexico's problems. Mexicans who make a living off the drug trade will seek to replace their income by selling drugs, and the most legal substitute is other illicit activities, such as extortion, kidnapping, and bank robbery, which often have a greater impact on civilians. Now let's move on to my opponent's point on trafficking. Heightened immigration surveillance doesn't solve for human trafficking, but it increases the demand for human smuggling, growing the trafficking economy. Johnson 07 writes that migrants depend on smugglers for passage into the U.S., and heightened enforcement will cause an increase. Additionally, there will be heightened demand as people will have to take more dangerous routes. And on international conflict, the U.S. support is useless. Bochov found that Western military supplies to Ukraine don't contribute to the resolution or to the confrontation, since they are not accompanied by equal pressure on Kyiv. Our border is not what is going to change things for the entirety of the world. And if we have a Mexican state collapse based on our increased surveillance, that will only trigger our opponent's impacts. And that is why you should vote for the negative side. Thank you.
We'll take 30 seconds of prep starting now. That was 15 seconds. Let me write that down. All right, structure of the speech is going to start by defending AF and then attacking their side. So it'll be AF and then egg. All right. Is everyone ready? Perfect. That case, time begins now. Let's start on our case. They give you two top shelf responses. First, they tell you that surveillance fails. It takes a long time to build. They miss the Strickler evidence, which tells you that the technology already exists. It's sitting in a warehouse. We just need Congress to deploy them. It's not going to take a while. The tech exists. Second, they tell you that Mexican cartels will adapt. I would say that significantly increasing surveillance plus surveilling the entire border plus increasing new revolutionary tech is a completely different story. And besides, AF is the only risk of solvency. What the neg is essentially arguing is that we just sit here and allow all of the arms, drugs, and human trafficking to continue. We're the only risk of solvency. You can vote there. But specifically onto cartels, they tell you that there's currently more peace. Our Murray evidence is more recent, and it tells you that cartels are currently in control of 1/3 of Mexico. But second, they say that our evidence is from a random author. I would say that our evidence still proves that cartels are rising to power. All of the other evidence throughout case tells you see an increase in arms trafficking and drugs trafficking. That's all proof that cartels are rising to power. But then specifically on arms, they tell you that they give you these two responses that cartels will get arms from other places. First, it's not as easy. Getting them from the southern border is so easy because it's right next to their land and there's literally no security there, which is why they're doing it now. And second, they can't prove that they've ever gotten guns from like China, and it's probably not going to happen. Then they tell you Biden's already pushing for like gun regulations. It's clearly not working. They need to prove that. Onto drugs, they tell you that Mexico will that these cartels will replace drug activity with other illegal activities. I would say that drugs is still a huge part of their profits, and that means that you weaken cartels. But even then, that's still not an explanation as to why we shouldn't be saving all of the lives that are associated with drug trafficking. Lastly, on human trafficking, they tell you that there's going to be an increase in demand for smuggling. But realize that, again, AF is the only risk of solvency because by increasing surveillance, you actually give us an opportunity to catch these smugglers. Again, in their world, they let 57,000 victims continue to get trafficked. But lastly, on our second argument about international conflict, all of their responses are over time. The only thing is that US support is useless. Remember, that doesn't address the actual reasoning behind the argument. We tell you that if the US cannot control its own borders, adversaries are emboldened because they think the US is weak. And that's why you see Russia invade Ukraine, Iran proxy wars in the Middle East. But let's talk about their arguments. Start on cartels. Remember that cartels have the same incentive to take power in either world. It's just uncontrolled in the neg. If you don't control them or have anything against them, such as surveillance, it's going to become even easier for them to take over. But on deportation specifically, they don't explain how putting surveillance on the border would cause deportations at all. We're doing things like scanning vehicles for drugs, not surveilling all of America and looking for people to deport. But second, their evidence about deportation is about Central America and El Salvador's civil war. That doesn't have anything to do with increasing border surveillance. On recruitment, remember that AV weakens cartels, so people have less of an incentive to join. And lastly, on fueling profits, putting surveillance means we catch the cartels. Each time cartels try to charge more money, and they try to cross, we're going to put an end to that. On agricultural labor shortage. First, surveillance tech allows for faster processing of migrants, meaning we can allow in more laborers, as Modine 24 finds, and AI automates tasks like data entry and document review, significantly reducing wait times. But second, H-2A workers fill the gap. As AIC24 finds, the H-2A program allows employers that face a shortage of workers to hire foreign nationals, and the number of H-2A workers are increasing by 64%. But third, Mexico is running out of farmhands anyways. As Sheridan24 finds, Mexico had an inexhaustible supply of farmhands, but the country is running short, having 1.5 million unfilled job openings and 10 to 15% below the number of pickers they need for spring. But lastly, on the deportation evidence from their C2, their evidence about empirics of deportation is from the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It had nothing to do with increasing border surveillance. It had to do with policing and fingerprints. Thus, the agricultural industry won't be hurt. We're not deporting anyone. The only thing we're doing is making it more safe to catch cartels, to catch armed traffickers, to catch drug traffickers and human traffickers. To save lives, you're voting for the AF for Richard Montgomery. Are you ready for cross?
Yes, we're ready for cross-examination.
You can have first question.
All right, I'll start my time in 3, 2, 1. So first, I just wanted to talk about how your point on arms and how you say that it's not going to be as easy and that there's no prior connections to any of these countries. But how would you respond to the fact that if guns are the primary things that are keeping these cartels in power, do you not believe that they would work a bit harder so that they can get them from these other places, and that with the billions of dollars that we both agree that they have, they would simply be able to innovate and continue to get guns from other places?
Yeah, so a couple of problems there, right? I would say that first, maybe for some of the large cartels, they're able to do that in the long run. But I would say that second, it's just you can't prove that it's actually feasible to get a gun from like China. But then third, you say they have billions of dollars and they're able to do that. I would say when you do things like control the drug trade, that cuts the majority of their profits, which is why they don't actually have billions of dollars to try to get arms from China, which is like an entire ocean away. So I would just say that seems like a very far stretch to me, right? Because currently all they have to do is literally go like in their backyard cross the border to get guns. But also second, the US has really lax like regulations. So I would just say in general, there are so many reasons why it's so much easier to get guns from the US.
Okay, do you have a question?
Yes. Let's talk about the labor short, or let's talk about deportation. How is increasing border surveillance, such as scanning vehicles, going to surveil immigrants all across the US like homeland to look for people to deport? Like what technology are we?
We have a few responses to that. First, you can look at the precedent where when they increased surveillance and they increased people who were watching specifically on our southern border, we saw that there was hundreds of thousands of people more who were
that was
being
because of policing and fingerprints. I read the evidence.
It's still an example of surveillance, as it is people on the border watching to ensure that those people are there. That is just one of the many examples of the types of surveillance that could be used on the border. Not one specific thing can be said.
Your evidence said that somewhere in California, police were using fingerprint data from every time they made an arrest, and that's how they made deportations. That has nothing to do with border surveillance. That's just a policing tactic that they used. But either way, you have a question.
Can I complete the question?
That was my question. You can have one now.
I mean, can I add a follow-up to that?
Sure, that can be your question.
Yes, I just wanted to add to the fact that we already also have evidence from the recent White House where they have had changes when it comes to surveillance and things like that, which has also led to increases in deportation. And it's simply intuitive. You can look back into our evidence, and it specifically tells you that there's going to be heightened levels of deportation. When we have higher surveillance on the border, the sole thing that they're going to be looking for is not just going to be terrorists. That would be a perfect thing for the affirmative world to say that that's the sole thing they're going to do. But many people within America are also pushing for narratives for them to also be deporting more people.
Therefore, everything you said has nothing to do with border surveillance. So I don't think it's intuitive, as you said, that putting scanners for drugs is going to deport someone who lives in Kansas. Like, that does not make any sense, but that's crossfire.
Okay. All right, and we'll take running prep time going from there. Yep. We have around 55 seconds for that. That's our prep time. Real quick, just gonna make sure everyone can hear me. We're all good. Awesome. Again, I'm Charlie Price. This is the first summary of the round for the -3 minutes. For a quick off-time roadmap, gonna be going over the affirmative case, then the negative case, and then weighing at the end. Hope that works. Real quick, opponents ready? Judge is ready? Awesome. Okay. Then my time will begin in 3, 2, 1. First, let's look at the overview we attached to our opponent's case where we told you that surveillance fails and takes too long to implement. Their only response to this is that this technology already exists, but what they're letting pass through is that this will disrupt the economy, and that just because this technology exists and is sitting in a warehouse, it still requires workers to put in the ground and implement across the 2,000 miles of barrier that is the southern border. That's going to use all of our workers. That's going to disrupt our economy. That's going to kill the southern border's livelihood. Now let's move to their first contention of combating cartels. To this, we respond multiple times. First, we tell you that cartels will cause adaptation. We saw this after 9/11, and they tell you that new tech will stop this. That's exactly what they said. After 9/11, cartels will always continue to adapt. They've done that before. They'll do it again. Now on to guns. Again, we tell you that they can go to other markets. These cartels have billions of dollars. They can do this very easily. They can also go to Florida ports. That gets unresponded to by our opponents. All they say on these other markets in other countries is that they're not as easy to go to. That doesn't matter. These are multi-billion near governmental organizations. Of course, they could go international by their guns if it's something they truly need. Our opponents are providing no solvency, just mitigating a problem that they won't stop. Now let's move on to their ideas on drugs. First, we tell you that these high-tech scanners don't work. We provide you evidence of this in rebuttal. Then looking at what else they've said, we tell you that these cartels will always diversify. They say that drugs are high profit, so it's good we get rid of that. They won't be solving this drug problem in the affirmative world because cartels are international. If you get rid of drugs going into America, they will fuel drug markets in South America, in Europe, anywhere else. These cartels will stay alive, do or die. They are not solving. These deaths will continue. Furthermore, we tell you that with increases to towers and stopping on human trafficking, all they're doing is increasing demand. Look to our Solus 23 evidence we provided in case, which shows that when you stop these things or when you implement new surveillance, all you're doing is getting more money for the cartels, taking more dangerous routes. They're saying they're trying to provide solvency, but all they're doing is hope to help a problem that they're really making worse. On their second contention of international conflict, as we stated, the support from the United States has not been effective in Ukraine. Furthermore, if we're believing that the United States border problems are the reason that Russia invaded Ukraine and a myriad of other problems happening in the East and places far away from us, that is completely illogical. No way that Russia decided, oh, hey, look, the US border is weak, let's go invade Ukraine. That's illogical. Disregard this entire argument. They're providing no solvency. Now let's move to the negative. First, on our evidence of Panda 23 and Katroff 24, where there are 4 years of increased progress. There's 1.4% increase just in 2023. Scheinbaum is cracking down. All they state is that cartels control 1/3 of the country. Doesn't matter. We're seeing progress right now. We're seeing status quo increasing. They ask, how is deportation going to increase? We tell you 4 different answers. We tell you, look at our precedent from 2008. There's been an increase in deportation. We tell you this is a right-wing policy. It's inherently associated with increased deportation. We tell you that Biden has been increasing deportation. So it's happening in a democratic world. And we show that they're stopping replenishment from other migrants who would then go into the agricultural field. Then looking at labor shortage, all they're saying is that AI and H-2A visas are going to solve. AI is hard. It's not been implemented. It's expensive. It's not going to help release farmers. And H-2A visas are cyclical. They go up, they go down, but it never helps. We outweigh on probability and magnitude probability because what's happening is in the status quo magnitude because we're avoiding a state collapse. For that, vote negative. Thank you.
Grace, how much prep time did you take?
15 seconds.
Okay, I'll take running prep and then I'll let you know how much I've taken. All right, that was 2 minutes. Is everyone good? Oh, before that, it's just going to go international conflict and then cartels. And then labor. So is everyone good? Okay, great. Even if the cartel debate gets way too messy, you already have an independent reason to vote for us. And that is on our second contention about international conflict. They give you 2 responses, which are new in summary and weren't in their rebuttal, but let's respond to them. First, they say that US support is useless in Ukraine. Great, that's not our argument. Second, they say it's completely logical. First, there's no evidence for this. Second, it's just their assertion. So let's explain the argument because it's very simple. The Hunter evidence tells you that right now, allies are questioning the US because of our border crisis. The perception is key. And when we have a weak perception, that is what emboldens all of our autocratic adversaries to feel emboldened and see the green light as more aggression, because they don't think that America is going to intervene in their conflicts if they can't even control their territorial sovereignty. But the IE evidence is very clear and goes conceded, and it tells you that when you implement surveillance, it revolutionizes border security, and that is able to change the perception that the US can finally control its territorial sovereignty. Remember, the Hunter evidence is really clear, and it tells you that this perception is what emboldens our adversaries. At that point, you should feel comfortable voting off of this argument. But this is why you prefer it over everything they say. The link into autocracy and conflict goes completely conceded in both of their speeches, and that also causes the rise of crime. That supercharges their impact on a global scale because things like war, famine, and instability foster the growth of both migrants and refugees, which A, increase general instability and conflict around borders in the world, and B, contribute to the rise of organized crime groups like cartels, instead on an international scale. That is why you're going to be voting for that or why you're voting for international conflict. But let's talk about cartels, right? The main thing here is that you don't hear one sentence in their previous speech about what we're doing right now to solve it. That means that in either world, there are going to be loopholes, there are going to be things, but in the affirmative world, it's the only place where you see solvency, where you try and prevent 30,000 people from dying from gun deaths, and then also 250,000 people dying from overdose deaths. Let's look at their responses. The first thing they say is that cartels always adapt, but realize they don't actually interact with what my partner tells you, that A, it's a lot different to ship things overseas compared to trafficking it across the border based on time. B, it takes a lot more effort. C, the US is the largest drug market compared to like Europe or China. And D, you've never seen Mexican drug cartels get drugs into China because of their strict regulations. The last thing that I want to talk about is on labor and profits, right? They give you all of these responses and it makes no sense. They say H2As are cyclical. Sure, that doesn't matter insofar as there's so much demand, a 64% increase in demand for H2As, that there are always going to be migrants that want to fill this position. Insofar as labor is always going to have demand, and they tell you that it doesn't really make sense. At the end of the day, surveillance is not policing. We have militarized the border, but that is different from having drug scanners and arms scanners, which is why you want to vote for the F. You good for cross?
Okay, that was great. We are ready for grand cross as well. Judges, are you ready? Okay, awesome. Then I'll start the time in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so could we start off, and do you mind if we have the first question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's start off on your second contention of international conflict. So from our perspective, the United States spends the most money on military in the world, as the strongest military. It's, economically dominant and very viable on the world stage, right? Furthermore, if we look at a conflict like Russia and Ukraine, that has hundreds of years of back history. We can look back to like the USSR and just crucial clashes between those two groups. So could you explain to me in your second contention why the US not surveilling its border is causing Russia to invade the Ukraine right now?
Right. So what we tell you isn't that it's the border crisis directly causing the Ukraine conflict. It's the perception that links the two. So if the US right now, with its border crisis, with like 1/3 of cartels controlling Mexico and having a worse border crisis than ever before, it's perceived like they can't even control their own territorial sovereignty, it makes no sense to our adversaries overseas why the US would be effective in intervening overseas, whether in like the Russia-Ukraine conflict or proxy wars in Iran. All of that means that when the US is perceived as weak, our adversaries are emboldened to start more conflict because they know the US won't get involved, or even if they do, they're too weak to do that.
Quick follow-up. Did the US not then get involved in Ukraine and send support and aid to them?
Well, you're the
Did
one
they not
that's
get
telling me
involved?
that it was ineffective, isn't it?
But that's not what I'm saying, though. Did they not get involved?
But you're telling me it's ineffective,
Yes
which
or
just
no? Did the
confirms the
US get involved?
perceptions.
Yes or
Yeah,
no?
sure, but it was ineffective.
That
Right.
doesn't matter, though. What you're
I
arguing
think
is
we're
that
kind
they
of
won't get
having a
involved, and they
misunderstanding
did.
here, right?
What I'm not understanding is you're telling me that if the border's weak, other powers will see that the US won't get involved in international conflicts. But then you provide this idea of Ukraine where the US got involved. So I'm not seeing the connection between our adversaries being emboldened by this thing happening 2,000 miles away from them when we're clearly doing the thing you're saying we won't do.
Okay, so a couple of things here, right? The first thing, I never said it wasn't that the US would not get involved, but the US wouldn't be effective when they're involved. And you exactly told me that because in your past two
Why
speeches, you have told
won't
me
they be
that, can you let me
effective?
finish, please? You have told me in your past two speeches that the US's involvement in Ukraine has exactly been ineffective and useless. The second thing is that I think we just need to take a step back, right? If you are the president of one country and you see that another country is struggling domestically with that or with keeping their territorial sovereignty, you're obviously going to think that that country is weak. And if that country happens to be the most powerful country in the world with a bunch of adversaries that want to be aggressive, don't you see that as a green light for aggression, or that they won't be effectively involved in your aggression because they're already struggling with domestic issues?
So the status quo, where the US spends most on military, is the most powerful, is most economically dominant, is being viewed as weak right now.
Yes, and that's cross.
That's what the Hunter evidence said.
Okay, thank you.
We'll take the remainder of our prep time. We'll stop time now. Okay, so just to provide a quick off-time roadmap, first, I'm just going to be talking about a little bit about our overview, and then I'm going to go down our case, their case, and Wang, if that's good for everybody. Okay, so I will start my time in 3, 2, 1. Judges, let's first look at our overview. Our overview specifically tells you that surveillance might not actually even be able to be something that is instituted, given the incredible difficulty that it would have with the labor markets. Our opponent's only response to this is that they say that we already have the technology existing, that we just need to put it out there. But it's the putting it out there that we don't even know that we can do, which they cannot respond to. The institution of it is going to be necessary, and we cannot hold this as something that is high probability. Therefore, we can't even say that the success of these surveillance technologies is going to flow through on their side. Additionally, let's go down to our point on combating cartels. Remember, we tell you that Mexico's peacefulness has increased by 1.4% in 2023, and that the new Mexican president, as mayor, has cracked down on cartels, and that the cartels are currently at a turning point, given the different busts that they have that has occurred, and given the new legislation. We need to ensure that all this is happening. Our opponents say that we provide no solvency, but in the current status quo, that is what is happening. Now we can move on to our point about agriculture. Again, we provide you with 4 types of precedent from right-wing policies, Biden's policies, and intuition that tell you that deportations will increase. And when they increase, that will ultimately take away from our agricultural sector and increase poverty. We cannot have this happen. In their case, we take down their points on arms and trafficking, and they have a general lack of responses. We tell you that they'll be able to adapt, and these are billion-dollar organizations that will be able to go to new markets. Additionally, they say that it's going to be too far to go to China, but we tell you about South America, another place that they could take advantage of. On trafficking, there are no clear points that they carry throughout the entire round, therefore we win. And on international affairs, remember when we tell you that a Mexican state collapse would show that we have extreme weakness, and we tell you that when these cartels get hundreds of thousands of new people from the increased deportation that would come from surveillance, they would only get more powerful, causing a Mexican state collapse and showing badly on America, and overall making it to where our opponents' own impacts are more negative in their world. We outweigh on probability because we provide you with precedent on deportations. We provide you by saying that surveillance might not even be something that's successful. And we provide you with multiple empirics to tell you that there's current success that can be turned in magnitude because we infect the entire world and North America, while our opponents are only affecting smaller groups of people. Thank you.
We have 45 seconds of prep left, so we'll take that starting now. All right. The structure of this speech is going to start on international conflict and then cartels, and then their case. So international conflict, cartels, agriculture. Is everyone ready for the last speech of the tournament? All right, cool. That case, my time begins now. If the cartel debate has been too messy for you, here's an independent reason as to why you're voting for AF for Richard Montgomery. Let's look at international conflict. They've spent 15 seconds on this argument in every single speech throughout the round. You should feel very comfortable voting here. Right now, Hunter 22 tells you that allies and adversaries are pondering US strength and commitment because they see that the US cannot control their own borders and their own domestic security. So why should they have a role in the international realm? This green lights aggression from our adversaries and tells them it's okay because the US cannot do anything. Perceptually, the US is weak. And that's why you've seen that adversaries are emboldened, like Russia and like Iran. They give you this overview about how systems won't be deployed, but that doesn't make sense. Systems have always been deployed. There's always a market for it. It's very easy. I would say that filling these jobs is a good thing. There's literally no warrant for this whole economic collapse argument. It's really silly. But then they drop the weighing that has gone conceded this entire round. They link into autocracy and conflicts. Conflict is the root cause of crime. This supercharges the impacts on a global scale as war, famine, and instability fosters the growth of both migrants and refugees, which A, increases general instability and conflict around borders in the world, and second, contributes to the rise of organized crime groups like cartels, increasing violence around the world. If you're looking at magnitude and having an impact on a larger scale, you're going to be voting to prevent conflict on the AF. But let's talk about cartels. It got really messy here. They keep repeating the same responses. Here's 4 reasons why you're voting for us. First, realize AF is the only risk of solvency. They just sit there and do nothing. Cartels are controlling 1/3 of Mexico and letting that continue to happen. But second, surveillance already exists. It's easy to implement. Third, we've never seen like cartels get arms from Florida. It's not going to happen. And then fourth, US is the largest market. It's the easiest to cross the border. It's harder to get arms from like China. You've seen that in the past. Everything has been from the US. It's all really silly. But lastly, on deportations, their evidence is about policing and fingerprints, nothing to do with border surveillance. And remember, H-2A workers fill the gap, 64% increase in demand. None of their arguments you should consider. You should be looking to save lives on a global scale by voting for international conflict for AF for Richard Montgomery.
Good round. You guys really good.
Awesome.